A Promise Written in the Stars. Chapter 1. The Sky Between Us. The sea always smelled of memory in Capelder. It wasn't the bright salt scent tourists loved in summer, but something quieter, a breath of driftwood, fog, and old longing that wrapped around the town like a shawl. People here spoke softly, as if not to disturb the ghosts that clung to the docks. Eliza Crane had lived most of her 47 years in Capelder. Her hair, once a storm of auburn waves, was streaked now with silver that caught the lamplight like threads of sea glass. Every morning before dawn, she walked the winding path down to the shoreline, coffee in hand, coat unbuttoned just enough to let the chill in. The same path she had walked 25 years ago, when the world had still felt wide and full of stars. That morning, fog rested heavy on the harbour. The boats looked like sleeping animals tethered to the pier. From somewhere across the water came the low hum of a radio playing an old love song, the kind that never really ended. It just faded into the sea. Eliza stopped by the weathered railing, her breath visible in the damp air. She set her coffee down and tilted her head back. Even with the sky veiled in grey, she looked for them, the stars. She'd done it every morning since the night he left. His name was Daniel Whitmore. He'd grown up just a few streets away, in a house that smelled of lemon or oil and his mother's piano. He was quiet in that boyish, restless way, full of words he never said, thoughts that always seemed half a world away. When they were 16, they'd snuck out to the old observatory on the hill, a dome of rust and dust left from a time when someone in town cared about the stars. The telescope no longer worked, but they had climbed the steps anyway, sat beneath the cracked glass, and looked up. That was the night Daniel had said it. If you ever get lost, he'd told her, look for Orion. I'll be somewhere under the same sky, wishing you home. She had laughed, young and certain that promises like that never broke. But youth has a way of believing forever means something you can hold. When Daniel left for Boston a year later, she had waved from the pier, believing he'd be back before the tide changed. But the years became decades. Letters came less often, until they stopped altogether. And still, every night, Eliza found herself standing beneath the same sky, searching for Orion. That morning, as the fog began to lift, she noticed something unusual, a boat tied to the outer dock. One she didn't recognize. It was small, painted navy blue, the name the Voyager stenciled in silver. Its hull looked new, but its presence felt old, familiar. She heard footsteps behind her, still chasing stars. Liz, the voice, deep, gentle, impossibly familiar, sent her heart stumbling. She turned, half afraid she had conjured him out of memory. Daniel stood there, his hair now peppered with grey, eyes the same quiet blue she remembered. A duffel hung from his shoulder, his coat damp with sea mist. For a moment, neither of them moved. You came back, she said, softly. He smiled, that crooked, boyish smile she'd seen last under the glow of the observatory's broken dome. I told you I would, he said. You just had to keep looking up. They walked together along the boardwalk in silence, the sound of their steps mixing with the whisper of waves. Time stretched between them, not awkward, but fragile, like glass. He told her he'd left the city a month ago. Too many lights, he said. You can't see the stars anymore. She laughed softly. Maybe that's why people move there, so they don't have to remember what they've lost. He looked at her, something unspoken flickering behind his eyes. And what did you lose, Eliza? She wanted to say you, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said, a lot of years. By the time they reached the cafe, rain had begun to fall, a soft drizzle that turned the cobblestones slick and silver. They took the small corner table by the window, the one where she always sat alone. The waitress, a girl barely 20, looked between them and smiled, sensing the history in their silence. Eliza wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. You still drink it black? Daniel nodded. Old habits die hard. For a while, they spoke of nothing, the weather, the changes in town, the new bookstore that had replaced the bait shop. But underneath every word was the same quiet heartbeat of what wasn't being said. Finally, she asked, why now, Daniel? After all this time, he looked out the window, where the rain blurred the world into watercolor. Because I realized something, he said. You can't keep a promise written in the stars if you stop looking up. Eliza stared at him, her throat tightening. And what if the stars have changed? Then, he said softly, we find new ones. That night, after he walked her home, she stood on her porch long after he was gone. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cold. When she looked up, the clouds had parted, and there it was, Orion, clear and steady above the horizon. For the first time in 25 years, she smiled through tears. Some promises, she thought, don't fade. They just wait for the right sky. Chapter 2. Letters Never Sent. The rain had rinsed the night clean. Capelder slept under a sheet of fog, and Eliza sat by her window, wrapped in a wool blanket, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The clock on the mantel ticked softly. An old friend she no longer noticed most nights, except now, when the silence felt like an answer waiting to be read. Daniel was back. The words still didn't sit right in her mind. They felt like a note slipped under the door of her life. Unexpected. Familiar handwriting, the ink not yet dry. She reached for the drawer beneath the desk, the one she hadn't opened in years. Inside, tied with faded ribbon, lay a bundle of yellowed envelopes, some sealed, some never addressed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon. The first envelope read, Daniel Whitmore, Boston, M.A., not sent. Inside, folded carefully, was a letter written 20 years ago. Dear Daniel, do you ever still look at the stars? I do. Some nights I swear I can feel you out there, just beyond the dark. I keep wondering if you meant it. That promise. I hope you did, because I did too. Eliza. She had written it the night her mother died. The night she had needed someone who knew her before the grief, before the weight of staying, but she had never mailed it. Maybe because it felt selfish, or maybe because she was afraid that the Daniel on the other end no longer believed in promises written under a teenage sky. Now, seeing him again had reopened all of it, the ache, the questions, the part of her that had stayed frozen between the tides. The next morning, fog still clung to the harbour when she saw him again. He was at the dock, mending a fishing net with hands that looked older, stronger, but still moved with the same quiet patience she remembered. She hesitated, then called softly, You were always terrible at that. He looked up, that same crook smile flickering. Still AM. They fell into step without planning to, walking toward the cafe again. The same route, but different air. He spoke first. You never left, did you? Eliza shook her head. No. Someone had to stay and make sure the tide still came in. Daniel's laugh was low, a sound that felt like an exhale after years of holding breath. I've thought about this place more times than I can count, he said. About you. She looked away, toward the gulls circling over the pier. Then why didn't you write? He stopped walking. I did. Later, at the cafe. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table. A small stack of letters, edges worn, the top one addressed to Eliza Crane, Cape Alder. I wrote these, he said quietly, every time I wanted to come back, every time I didn't know how. She stared at the stack, her breath catching. You never sent them. He shook his head. I was afraid you'd moved on, or worse, that you hadn't. For a moment, all she could hear was the rain outside. Then, carefully, she untied the string and opened the first letter. June 4th, 2004. Eliza, do you ever think about that night at the observatory? The way the dome creaked when the wind moved through it? I do. I think about how sure I was that I'd come back before the stars faded. But the world kept pulling me further. I built a life that looked right from the outside, but it never fit. Every night I looked up, I saw your name written in the sky I left behind. Her vision blurred, and she blinked the words back into focus. You could have come back, she whispered. Daniel's voice was quiet, raw. I didn't know how to come back without disappointing the person you remembered. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. You were the only person I never expected anything from, Daniel. You didn't have to be perfect. You just had to be here. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers, just barely, like a memory testing if it could still exist in the present. They spent the afternoon walking along the shoreline. The tide was low, leaving behind ripples of sea glass and shells. Each step felt like rediscovery, small, cautious, but real. He told her about his life, the years teaching at the university, the divorce that had left him quiet for too long, the night he realized he was living a story he hadn't chosen. She told him about staying, caring for her mother until the end, keeping the bookstore open even when no one read anymore. Learning to live with silence. When the wind picked up, he said, I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving. I told myself I was giving us both a chance to grow. Eliza smiled softly. Sometimes growing means standing still. As evening came, they reached the top of Alder Hill, where the old observatory still stood. The rusted dome leaned slightly now, vines curling around its base. The door creaked when Daniel pushed it open. Inside, the dust smelled like time. God, he said softly, it's smaller than I remember. Everything is, she whispered. They climbed to the top platform, where shards of glass still framed the night. The stars were beginning to appear, faint, then clearer, one by one. Daniel exhaled, a sound halfway between awe and regret. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed? She looked up at Orion, just rising above the horizon. All the time, they stood in silence, the years between them folding inward like paper. Finally, Eliza said, maybe some promises aren't meant to be kept. Maybe they're meant to remind us of who we were when we made them. Daniel turned to her, eyes soft. And who are we now? She smiled faintly. To people who still look up. As they left the observatory, he stopped by the doorway and pressed a small envelope into her hand. It's the last one, he said. I wrote it last winter. I wasn't sure I'd ever have the courage to give it to you. When she got home that night, she opened it under the lamplight. Eliza, there isn't a day I don't look for you in the stars. I used to think our story was unfinished, but maybe it's just written across to wider sky for us to see all at once. If you ever read this, know this much. You were the constant in every constellation I ever found. D. Eliza folded the letter, pressing it to her chest. Outside, The night was clear, the stars bright, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for anything. Chapter 3: Tides of Memory. The next morning broke pale and glassy, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it is. The tide was retreating, leaving thin trails of foam on the sand. Eliza stood barefoot on the shore, her skirt brushing her ankles, a letter clutched in one hand. The letter Daniel had given her still pulsed through her. Not just the words, but what they meant. That someone, somewhere, had kept her memory alive when she thought the world had moved on. She turned the envelope over in her palm, tracing his handwriting, looping, steady, the same as when they were 17 and he'd scrawled constellations in the margins of her notebooks. She smiled at the thought, at how certain they'd been that life could be charted like stars. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn. She knew who it was by the sound of them. Couldn't sleep either. Daniel asked. Eliza shook her head. You ever notice how the sea doesn't stop moving, even when everything else does? He nodded. Maybe that's why we come back to it, to remind ourselves there's still motion. They stood there for a while, watching the horizon slowly catch the light. As they walked back toward town, Daniel spoke quietly. I went by your bookstore last night. Eliza smiled faintly. It's small, but it smells like home, dust, paper, and too much coffee. He looked at her. You still run it alone? She shrugged. Always did. People don't read like they used to, but the few who do, they make it worth it. Daniel hesitated, then said, I could help. I'm not planning on leaving soon. The words hung between them like a held breath. She looked at him, uncertain whether to believe it. You said that once before. He nodded, eyes on the sand. I know. And I broke that promise. I don't want to do that again. Eliza studied his face, the fine lines, the weariness that time had etched into kindness. You can't fix the past by staying, she said softly, but you can honor it. They spent the day together at the bookstore. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels full. Daniel unpacked a box of old poetry books she'd bought at auction, each one smelling faintly of another century. He opened one and read aloud. The stars are not wanted now. Put out everyone. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Eliza looked up from the counter. Auden. He smiled. You still remember? I remember everything, she said. Later that afternoon, an old man came in, a fisherman named Walter, who'd known them both since childhood. He stopped short when he saw Daniel. Well, I'll be damned, he said with a grin. Didn't think I'd see your face in this town again. Daniel laughed. Neither did I. Walter looked between them, sensing something in the air. You two planning on staying put this time, or just visiting old ghosts? Eliza smiled softly. Maybe both. The man chuckled and left them to the hush of the store. After he was gone, Daniel said, You know what's strange? Everyone here still feels the same. It's like the town doesn't age. Eliza closed a book gently. Maybe we do the aging for it. That evening, the two walked down to the pier. The wind carried the faint scent of rain again, the kind that always came without warning. Daniel looked out over the water. Do you ever think the sea remembers us? All the people who've walked its edge, whispered their stories into it. Eliza followed his gaze. If it does, it keeps the secrets better than we do. He smiled faintly. You think it remembers that night? She didn't have to ask which one. The observatory. He nodded. She exhaled. Of course it does. That was the night we wrote our promise, wasn't it? Daniel's eyes softened. A promise written in the stars. They stood there, side by side. As the sky darkened, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft as memory. Later, in her kitchen, Eliza found herself humming an old tune while boiling water for tea. The house felt different now, not empty, just aware. On the table lay a few of Daniel's letters, still unopened. She picked one at random. Eliza, some nights I dream I'm back in Capelder. The tide hums against the rocks, and I can hear your voice reading something from a book I never finished. I wake up before I can remember the words. Maybe that's how the universe works, giving us fragments instead of endings. She read it twice, her eyes wet before she realized she was crying. When she looked up, Daniel was standing in the doorway, his expression gentle, almost shy. I didn't mean to read without asking, she said. He shook his head. They were meant for you, Eliza, all of them. She nodded, trying to steady her voice. Then let's not waste them this time. Outside, the rain fell harder. They stood by the window, listening to silhouettes framed by stormlight. Daniel spoke softly. When I left, I thought I was chasing something bigger than this town. Turns out, I was just running from how much it hurt to stay. Eliza looked at him, eyes glimmering. And now, he said, I'm just trying to remember how to begin again. She smiled through tears. You just did. That night, after he left, Eliza walked out to the porch again. The rain had stopped, leaving a faint mist over the fields. Above, the stars returned, faint but visible through the clearing sky. She thought of all the years she'd watched them alone, waiting for something she couldn't name. And now, for the first time, she realized the stars hadn't been keeping her waiting. They'd been keeping her company. Chapter 4. The Last Constellation. The night after the storm was the clearest Capelder had seen in months. The air carried that faint sweetness the sea sometimes leaves behind, like salt and lilac. The stars were scattered across the sky so sharply that Eliza felt she could almost reach up and trace the old constellations with her fingertips. She stood barefoot on her porch again, the wooden boards cool beneath her feet. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after rain, when even the waves seem to hold their breath. She thought about Daniel, about his letters, his voice, the quiet ache in his eyes, and for the first time, she realized something she'd never dared admit. She wasn't just remembering him. She was remembering who she used to be when he was near. The next morning, Daniel stopped by the bookstore again, carrying a paper bag that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Peace offering, he said, setting it on the counter. Muffins from that new bakery near the wharf. Eliza raised an eyebrow. You never used to like sweets. He smiled. Maybe I've changed. She looked at him for a moment, then said quietly, maybe we both have. They ate in comfortable silence, sunlight slanting through the window, dust motes drifting lazily through the air. Daniel watched her as she arranged books on the display, poetry on one side, local history on the other. You still alphabetize by emotion instead of title? He asked, teasing gently. She smiled. Of course, isn't that how people really read? By what they feel, not what they're told to find. Daniel laughed softly. You always said that. I think that's what I loved about you. The words hung in the air, not past tense, not future, just suspended, fragile. Later that day, they took a drive along the coast. The road wound between cliffs and sea, the sunlight flashing off the water like shards of memory. I used to come out here when I missed home, Daniel said, his voice low. I'd park by the edge and watch the horizon until it felt like the world was small enough to hold again. Eliza looked at him. And did it work? Sometimes, he said, but mostly, it just made me realize what I'd left behind. She turned her gaze back to the sea. We all leave something behind, Daniel. The trick is figuring out what's worth coming back for. He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. As the sun began to set, they reached the old lighthouse at the far edge of the cape. The building leaned slightly with age, its white paint flaking away like the pages of an old story. Daniel climbed the narrow spiral staircase, Eliza following. At the top, the view opened up, the sea stretching endlessly, the town below bathed in gold. He leaned against the railing. Do you ever think about how small we are? How the stars have seen everything we've ever done, and still, they just keep burning. Eliza nodded slowly. Maybe that's why we tell stories, to make our smallness mean something. He looked at her, eyes soft. Then ours has meaning. She met his gaze, her breath catching. It always did. They stayed there long after the sun disappeared, watching the first stars appear. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I found this, he said, from years ago. I never meant to keep it, but I guess I did. He handed it to her. It was a torn page from one of her old notebooks, her handwriting, looping across the lines. If we ever lose each other, meet me where the sky begins, under the first star we named. Eliza's throat tightened. I wrote that. He smiled faintly. You did. You were 17. We'd just named Orion our constellation. She traced the faded ink with her finger. You kept it all these years. I think, he said quietly, it kept me. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of the ocean. Eliza leaned against the railing beside him. What happens now, Daniel? He took a long breath. I don't know. I came back thinking I'd find what I lost, but maybe I just needed to remember it. She looked at him, her voice soft. And me. He turned to face her fully. You're the part I never stopped remembering. For a moment, the world fell away. Just the two of them, the lighthouse and the endless sky. But then Daniel looked down, and Eliza saw something shift in his expression, a shadow, quiet but heavy. I didn't tell you everything, he said finally. Eliza's heartbeat quickened. What do you mean? He hesitated, then looked out toward the sea. I came back because I'm sick. Eliza, not dying, not yet. But the doctors think it's only a matter of time. I didn't want to wait until the stars were the only ones left to tell you I kept my promise. The words hit her like a wave. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She reached for him instinctively, her hand finding his. You should have told me. I couldn't, he said. I didn't want this to be pity. I wanted it to be real. Whatever time we have. Tears welled in her eyes. You came home to say goodbye. He shook his head. No. I came home to say thank you. They stood there, the wind pressing against them, the sea murmuring below. Eliza whispered, Then let's make the time we have count. Daniel looked at her, eyes tired but alive. You still believe in promises? She smiled through tears. Only the ones written in the stars. Chapter 5. A Promise Kept. The sea was quieter in the mornings now. The gulls still wheeled above the harbour. The tide still sighed against the rocks. But the world seemed to move a little slower, as if Cape Horn itself had begun to listen to the silence between two heartbeats. Eliza sat on the porch of her bookstore, a mug of coffee growing cold beside her. The first light of dawn brushed the water in gold. She hadn't slept much since that night at the lighthouse. Daniel's words had stayed with her, not as pain, but as something gentler, a truth she wasn't ready to face, and yet couldn't turn away from. He was sick, but he was also here, and for however long that lasted, that had to be enough. When Daniel arrived later that morning, he was carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a bouquet of wildflowers, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Don't laugh, he said. The florist was closed. Eliza smiled. They're perfect. They sat together on the porch steps. The ocean stretched out before them. For a while, they said nothing. The air smelled of salt and the faint sweetness of the flowers between them. Finally, Daniel said softly, "You know, I used to think promises were just words. Something you said to make a moment feel bigger than it was. But I was wrong." Eliza looked at him. "What changed your mind?" "You," he said simply. "You always believed they meant something. I think that's why I came back, to keep mine." She reached out and took his hand. "Then let's keep it together." Days turned into weeks. They began a quiet routine. Morning coffee, afternoon walks, evenings spent watching the stars from the back porch. Daniel's health wavered, some days better than others, but he never complained. On good days, he helped her in the shop, reading to the children who came for story hour, fixing the creaky step near the counter, rearranging the shelves until the place felt almost new again. On bad days, he sat in the old chair by the window, a blanket draped over his legs, watching her work. Sometimes, he'd sketch the horizon in his notebook, lines and shadows, bits of sky. Once, she asked him what he was drawing. "Us," he said with a small smile. "The way we are now, between tides." She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. One night, after the shop had closed and the town had gone quiet, they drove back to the lighthouse. The moon was high, the stars clear and endless. Daniel leaned against the railing, his breath visible in the cool night air. "You know what I used to love about this place?" he said. "It never changed, even when everything else did." Eliza nodded. "That's why I stayed. The world can fall apart, but the sea still moves, the stars still rise." He turned to her. "And us." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We rise and fall, too, but we always find our way back." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Not new, the corners worn from years of being carried. "Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "this isn't a proposal. It's a reminder." Inside the box was a silver locket, tarnished slightly, engraved with a single word, "Always." She traced the letters with her thumb, her throat tight. "Daniel." He shook his head gently. "No promises about forever. Just this moment, and maybe the next." Tears blurred her vision. She fastened the locket around her neck. "Then that's enough." The weeks passed softly after that. Autumn came, the kind of autumn only small coastal towns know, where every gust of wind smells of pine and the ocean's edge glitters. With the last warmth of the year, Daniel grew weaker, his steps slower, but he never stopped walking to the porch each evening to watch the stars appear one by one. Sometimes, Eliza would read aloud from her favorite books, old poetry, mostly. Sometimes, they'd just sit in silence, hands entwined, letting the night speak for them. One evening, he looked up at the sky and whispered, "Do you think they remember us?" "The stars?" she asked. He nodded. She smiled through tears. "They remember everything." He smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's enough." The last night came quietly, not with fear, but with stillness. The sea was calm, the air warm. Eliza sat beside Daniel on the porch, his hand resting lightly in hers. He looked up at the sky one last time. Orion was rising, bright and familiar. "Eliza," he murmured, voice faint but clear. "Look, our star." She followed his gaze, tears catching in the starlight. "I see it." He smiled. "Promise me something." Anything. When I'm gone, keep looking up. She pressed his hand to her lips. I will. He closed his eyes. Then I'll always be there. And just like that, with the sound of the sea and the stars above, Daniel slipped quietly into the night. Winter came, soft and pale. The bookstore stayed open. Sometimes, customers would ask about the man who used to sit by the window sketching the horizon. Eliza would smile and say, he's part of the story now. Each night, she'd step onto the porch, the locket warm against her chest, and whisper the same words to the sky. I kept my promise. Above her, the stars shimmered, silent, witnesses to a love that had never needed forever to be true.